Good afternoon, everybody. Today is Wednesday, February 19th. My name is Wes Radu, and you are listening to Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of the Lord. Well, guys, it is good to be here for the very first episode of this new show. I've got to admit, I've recorded this episode like 3 different times, and the news keeps changing. And so that makes it a little bit tough to stay up to date on everything and get something out. But I finally decided how I want to present the content that we're going to go over today, and I'm excited to be with you. Okay, so before we get into the main portion of today's show, I did want to take a moment to react to something that I saw on social media. As many of you probably know, on Monday, February 17th, there was an accident at an airport in Toronto, Canada, where a Delta Airlines flight essentially landed, the wing broke off, it flipped over, and passengers had to crawl out of the fuselage while the plane was upside down. Thankfully, there were no fatalities as the result of the accident. MSNBC's Joe Scarborough reacted in the following way on his morning program.
This is not about politics. This is about keeping Americans safe, whether it's when they get on a plane. It's about keeping them safe, whether you're talking about the food that they eat, whether you're talking about safe in the air that our children breathe or the water that we all drink. I mean, that's what needs to be taken care of. Republicans, independents, Democrats alike need to focus on that. And this whole idea, by the way, it's nonsense. When you're hearing we have to do this to save money because we have to balance the budget. There's a $36 trillion debt. I can tell you 80% of that, 85% of that does not come from anything that DOJ is touching. This would be like a hotel getting bed bugs on the 11th floor and deciding they were going to burn down the whole hotel instead of changing the sheets and taking out the beds on the 11th floor. So we need this updating. It needs to be done, though, in a meaningful, thoughtful way that doesn't make Americans less safe. And everybody's sitting here talking about what the Democrats need to do. Democrats need to fight, Mika, to protect Americans' safety, to keep them safe.
So I know that's a little bit of a long clip, but I wanted to cut it in there. You can find that available on both MSNBC and Morning Joe's Instagram profiles. And boy, was there a lot to react to there. So first of all, you'll notice that Joe Scarborough talks a little bit about Republicans needing to cut spending, but I was laughing because his analogy goes to the exact opposite of what he was trying to say. What he was trying to say was Trump is just kind of cherry picking things that he thinks are useless or don't need government funding, and that, that's dangerous because he could end up pulling things, I guess, that could contribute to things like plane crashes, and that a more reasonable solution is Congress taking a look at where spending does and doesn't need to happen, and then they do, a massive overhaul. Except his analogy was a hotel that has bed bugs, and rather than, burn down the hotel, what we should do is remove the bedding from the 11th floor. Okay, well, what Trump is doing would be akin to removing the bedding from the 11th floor and not just shutting down the hotel like Congress would need to do. So the very first takeaway that I had was that, Scarborough's analogy really doesn't go to his main point. And I thought that was worth noting. Okay, the real kicker, though, was in suggesting that FAA cuts somehow contribute to a plane crash in Toronto. And if you didn't think that that's what he was saying, let me read you the caption. It says the following. At least 18 people were injured Monday when a Delta Airlines plane overturned upon landing in Toronto, just weeks after a fatal mid-air collision near Washington. Meanwhile, the Trump administration is firing hundreds of FAA employees as part of broader federal agency cuts. Morning Joe's at Joe Scarborough warns these cuts put American lives at risk, urging Democrats to take action. Quote, "This is not about politics. This is about keeping Americans safe," end quote. Okay, so we can agree that the FAA has no jurisdiction in Canada, correct? And a plane crash that was not the result of some sort of lack of regulation wouldn't fall under the FAA's responsibility. However, the irony, of course, is that, it doesn't fall under the United States jurisdiction now, but Trump, of course, has suggested otherwise. And I don't think what MSNBC was trying to say was that Canada should become the 51st state. Obviously, I'm not saying that either, but perhaps you can see the joke. I digress. Okay, well, that is not really what I wanted to talk about, because apparently the United States is in the middle of a constitutional crisis. And after all, that is what this episode is titled. Are we in a constitutional crisis? And I would love to break that down, because I do think that it's important that we analyze what Trump is doing. He is a controversial figure at least, and at most he pushes the limits, I think. And so he's definitely pushing the limits now to an extent, but I don't think we're in a constitutional crisis. And I think talking like we are is kind of dangerous, because it pales if we really were in a constitutional crisis. And I don't think Americans would recognize that, because apparently we're calling everything a constitutional crisis. And so let's talk about what is meant by that. First of all, I didn't actually know that this was something that people were saying until I really dug in to the news over the past week or so. And I realized, no, actually people are saying we're in a constitutional crisis. And so I listened to a whole bunch of material on what people think that crisis is. And there's not a clear consensus. This is somewhat of a buzzword being thrown around right now. And scholars who are weighing in on this are even willing to say there's a whole bunch of reasons that we're in a crisis, and that just doesn't make sense. So we're going to look at a couple of the most prominent ways that people are saying Trump is creating a crisis. But first, what I think is meant by constitutional crisis is essentially that Trump is going to do something outside of what he is allowed to do via the Constitution, right? Whatever his presidential powers are, he's going to step outside those bounds, or he's going to do something directly that the Constitution says is not allowed, right? An executive order that's not allowed. And then the court is going to say, no, you can't do that. And then Trump is going to ignore that court order. That is what I think is being suggested by this phrase, constitutional crisis, though even that is not particularly clear. So the most obvious way that's being suggested to happen is through Trump's recent executive order on birthright citizenship. So Trump comes out with this order, right, on birthright citizenship, saying that just because you're born in the United States doesn't mean that you are now a citizen. That is a questionable order, considering the 14th Amendment says that people born in the United States, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are given citizenship. Essentially, that's what it says. What people, particularly on the left, are worried about right now is that the court is going to smack down that order, right? And Trump's just going to ignore it. And he's gonna pull an Andrew Jackson, right? And say the courts have decided, now let them enforce it. I don't think that's going to happen for a lot of reasons, and particularly not in this scenario. Because first of all, the president would have to have the means to go against what the Supreme Court has said, and it's not even entirely clear that he has the means to do that. And by that, I mean, if the Supreme Court were to say, no, you can't just tell people that birthright citizenship isn't a thing anymore, he would have to get every hospital in the United States, right, on board with the idea that they're just not going to give citizenship now. And he would have to get the states on board with that, and it's just not going to happen. But the other aspect of this is is that, well, first of all, the Supreme Court may not decide how people think they're going to decide on this. I'm not saying that birthright citizenship is going to go away. What I am saying is that there is a phrase there, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and the court is going to have to decide what that means. And it may not be exactly what people are expecting that to be. I plan on doing a whole episode on that down the road, and I'm excited to do that because it involves some legal analysis, and that's really what I love to do best. I know I'm not an attorney, but not yet at least, but I'm excited to look at that because it's going to be a really cool issue just to analyze, right? And then there's a great Christian perspective on that as well that I think we can dig into. However, even if the court does decide that this executive order was totally unconstitutional, and even if Trump does come up with a way to totally ignore it and say, you know what, no, if you're born in the United States, I'm ignoring the court order and you're not getting your citizenship, then Congress still has the opportunity to impeach and convict Trump and remove him from office. And if Trump's directly ignoring court orders, there's going to be a lot of conservatives that are on board with that. And so this idea that we have a crisis just because the president is threatening to ignore court orders, and I would argue that he's not even threatening to ignore Supreme Court orders, but this idea that alone creates a crisis, I think is just wrong, because I think that at the end of the day, there is a way to enforce the Constitution on the president who ignores the court, right? The court doesn't have an army and they don't have power of the purse. They don't have an enforcement mechanism, but Congress does. And if Trump directly goes against what the Supreme Court says, then Congress, especially on an issue this big, then I believe that Congress will impeach and convict Trump and he won't be president anymore. Of course, this is not the only place that we are seeing fear of a crisis. So, you're probably aware that Trump has implemented DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, run by Elon Musk. And part of that initiative has been to cut a lot of spending. Most prominently in the news was Trump's getting rid of USAID or USAID, which offers foreign assistance to other countries. And the fear is that Trump is going to create a crisis by getting rid of this spending. And then again, the court will tell him, you can't do this. And Trump will ignore it and just continue to cut spending or not enforce spending that Congress has appropriated. Because ultimately, that's what this issue boils down to. Again, as I said a little bit earlier, Congress has the power of the purse, and that's really Congress's enforcement mechanism over the president. That's an important power, and it has to do with appropriations, which is, I'm going to admit, is a very complex process that I don't fully understand. When Congress writes the budget, they appropriate a whole bunch of money to the executive in order to spend accordingly. And that is a very complicated process. But let's break down why what Trump is doing here is legal too. The first thing that we should consider is that the president is allowed to say that Congress has appropriated too much funds, and so, he can send some money back, essentially. There are laws that regulate that. The Impoundment Control Act, or the ICA, was passed during the Nixon administration to lay out the exact process by which the president has to essentially ask Congress if he can, not use some of the funds that they've given him. However, it is noteworthy that Russell Vought, who is Trump's nominee for the director of the Office of Management and Budget, has said that he believes the ICA is unconstitutional to begin with, and the court hypothetically could decide that. I doubt that, because I think that personally, and I haven't looked super closely at this, but I'm not sure the court's going to overturn that precedent. And also, if Congress appropriates the funds and the president has the ability to ignore it, that kind of shifts the power of appropriations to the president. And so I don't think that the Supreme Court is just going to let Trump off in that way. However, there's other reasons here why this isn't a crisis, because there's also a time component to all of this, right? When the president comes into office and Congress, all this money is sitting there that was appropriated to the last administration, the courts are going to allow Trump to take a moment to analyze how that money is being spent, because there is a discretionary portion to this. When Congress does appropriations, sometimes they are very specific, right? But often, especially when it's appropriating to an organization like USAID, they don't go line item by line item, right? And so the president is able to say, okay, well, this much money's been given to USAID, and I'd like to give the money here, and I'd like to give the money here, or he is able to put people in place that get to choose how that money's spent. But because of the time component and the fact that Congress doesn't go line item by line item, the president is allowed to say, wait, hold up. I don't want this money just going out, right, to initiatives that I don't agree with, or to initiatives, more importantly, that the American people don't agree with. And we could argue whether or not USAID is using their money wisely or not. But because the president is allowed to take a moment to review how money's being spent, the courts are not going to order him to spend money. They're not going to do that. And so this is not a crisis either, because the Supreme Court is not going to tell Trump, you have to spend money through USAID here right now. It's just not going to happen. Further, I believe that Democrats are going to rue the day when Trump spends USAID money that he now has to spend in ways that they wouldn't have wanted that money to be spent, right? In other words, Trump should just cut those expenses. We don't want the government increasing inflation, right? Increasing the national debt exponentially like they have been. We don't want that. But if Trump is ordered that he has to spend this money, then he can't cut those costs significantly through the ICA. And again, Democrats will rue the day when that money is spent on initiatives that they don't agree with. I may not agree with all the ways Trump is going to spend the money, because I don't always tend to agree with the way he spends money. And so, this is a silly fight, because there's no crisis, and all it's doing is pushing Trump closer to spending money in ways that a lot of people probably don't want him to spend it. Okay, obviously, I feel a particular way about this. I don't like the hyperbole, especially by the media, when it comes to the court and the Constitution, and I don't like the notion that the courts are just powerless and Congress can't do anything about these actions that Trump are taking were they to violate things in the Constitution. And we only covered 2 of the ways that people are saying there's a crisis. There's like a million of them. Everything apparently is turning into a crisis. And it's also ironic to me that no one, ever said this about Biden. He did stuff too, like the Equal Rights Amendment that he just, kind of tweeted out one day that had been ratified, which it really hadn't been ratified. No one was out here saying, oh, this is such a crisis. I mean, the courts are going to say that this is not ratified, and it's not the law of the land like Joe Biden said it was. And so, I feel like this issue needs to be given some perspective. And if you are watching the news and you hear the phrase constitutional crisis, I would encourage you to just be comforted that everything is okay right now. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed my analysis of some current events today in the very first episode of this show. This is a Christian podcast, and sometimes my faith will very easily intertwine into what's going on in the world. And then sometimes things are a little more technical, like with a constitutional crisis. And while I'm positive that there's some application, it's just not as easy for me to string out. And so instead of kind of tell you how I think my relationship with Christ influences today's news, I wanted to share a little piece of encouragement with you. I was recently talking with a close friend about a decision that I needed to make that I was particularly challenged by. I was kind of laying out my options as you do when you have conversations like that. And he asked me, what do you want to do? I kind of thought to myself that was a funny question to ask because I was clearly asking for his advice. And as I start to tell him why I don't know and the pros and cons of each, he stopped me and he said, "No, what do you want to do? What are your goals? What are your priorities? What do you want to do?" And so I would ask you the same question. Whether you are 18 years old and entering college, or you are 80 years old and sitting at home retired listening to this new show, you should ask yourself, what are your goals? What are your priorities? What do you want to pursue? You see, ultimately, it's a pursuit of the Lord that will lead to the most fulfillment. That has not always been an easy lesson for me to learn, but I am confident that if you pursue Him, if you pursue Jesus, He will show you true fulfillment. He'll give you life, He'll give you liberty, and He'll give you much better than happiness. Go in peace, and God bless.